You're listening to Chicago Stories, a podcast from City Hall featuring the stories of everyday Chicagoans and special guests, as told to Mayor Emanuel.
Welcome to Chicago Stories. This is Mayor Emanuel. We're here with Dr. Richard Haass, President of the Council on Foreign Relations.
Great to be here.
And thanks for being here. I really appreciate it. So let me ask, how does a kid from Brooklyn become a foreign policy expert? I know Brooklyn politics is a bit of foreign policy, but what's the trajectory from Brooklyn to the State Department and to the Council?
Not by plan. When I got to college, which was not in your city, but not all that far, I was in the Midwest. I went to Oberlin. I got to campus, this is 1969, and asked around who was the best professor. And people said it was this guy named Tom Frank. And I said, what did he teach? And they said, New Testament. And I said, that's interesting. That's the Testament we never got to in my house. But I took it.
We never got on book one.
I took it. Got really interested in religion. Religion took me on an archaeological dig to the Middle East. Got interested in Middle Eastern stuff and politics and international relations. And the rest just happened.
When you're in the room, State Department, at the end of the Cold War and the first kind of page of the next chapter, did you ever think back then in the state that this is what would the end of the 21st century or the 20th century, that America at the pinnacle of its economic military would 18 years later be here? What was it like first in the room? Did you have a vision, or were you guys kind of walking without a compass at the end of, the Berlin Wall comes down, you have Kuwait and the first Gulf War?
Sure. First of all, I didn't see it coming. I'll be honest with you. I didn't see the end of the Cold War coming when it did. It was one of those assumptions we all made. That was just part of the architecture. You don't get up every morning and think the kitchen's going to be where the living room is. So one, admit that. Then after the Cold War ended, I did think that there was a chance that things would get messier, but I didn't expect it that soon. So when Saddam invaded Kuwait in the summer of 90, again, a bit of a surprise. But then there was a really palpable sense that everything we did and how we did it would set precedents. And one of the main reasons we resisted the aggression was to make sure that this new era didn't start off on the wrong foot. So it was really a conscious effort that we were shaping the future. That history wasn't something that was preordained.
We were writing it right then.
Absolutely.
In real time.
And it's actually a large way. I expect you have the same reaction from your time in government. There's not a whole lot that's inevitable. People, ideas,
personalities.
It all makes such a difference. There's so little that's really baked into the cake, and that was one of those moments.
You wrote Foreign Policy Begins at Home. What did you really mean by that?
It was at a time that I was worried that we weren't doing nearly enough domestically in order to maintain our competitiveness, our cohesion, the talent in our population. We weren't doing enough to groom it. And funnily enough, I wasn't arguing that foreign policy ends at home. It wasn't an argument for isolationism. It was an argument that if we were going to be successful in the world, we also had to be more successful at home. It was me. I wanted to make the point that me as a foreign policy jock was also making the case that domestic issues were important. Because in both sides of the coin, you often had people missing it. You had domestic first people ignoring the world, kind of isolationist, and you had foreign policy first people ignoring what was going on at home.
Well, Clinton always made this point that the walls between foreign policy and domestic policy are over, and that they're heads and tails of the same coin, and we got to see them more integrated.
More than ever, I would argue, in history because of globalization. And indeed, it's even hard now to say what policies fall under which. I mean, talking about, say, trade, immigration, it's almost arbitrary to put them in either box.
When you look back, and now that I have slightly more time on my hand, what in the last 20 years, because you just made this point that it happened fast from the pinnacle of economic and kind of the American dominance of foreign policy to where we are today. What do you think the elite got wrong, and what do you think the elite got right, if they got things? And there are both of those. And what were those things that, because you say fast, you wouldn't have seen in the 90s when I was in the White House, that it would be 15 years, 18 years, which is a blink of an eye in history. You go from here to there. I mean, the British Empire is a lot longer arc.
No, you're right. And I think I actually know that books are being written about this. How did the United States go from this pinnacle that was really without historic precedent to where we are today? To some extent, it's structural reasons. Countries rise, things like China. That wasn't something that's quote unquote our fault. It just happens. It's more difficult for mature economies to grow at the same clip as immature.
I didn't mean to interrupt you, but Was WTO wrong? Getting China into WTO, should we have a revision, a trick back, meaning look back provision? I mean, and keep going on this, but I mean,
I believe we were right to
but
bring
I mean,
China
it's
into.
a Jewish dinner table, so I'm going to interrupt you all the time. That's the most complete sentence you're ever going to get.
So you're saying it was 16
Yeah.
questions, 4
This
doesn't
is
do it?
Seder, question 1.
1A.
Yeah, exactly.
I believe we were right to let China into the WTO. Where I think we lost the bubble was not in monitoring it and adjusting it. And just because when we let them in almost 20 years ago as a quote unquote developing country, as they began to develop, we didn't dial things back. We didn't put their feet to the fire. So that's where I think we made the mistake, perhaps assuming that one way or another, that keeping them in was going to somehow moderate them. And I believe that we were just too idealistic or naive, and they gamed the system. And as they were doing it, we ought to have adjusted, and we didn't. I think more broadly, I thought we got it right with the way we ended the Cold War. I think the Kuwait-Iraq crisis we essentially got right. Where I think we got it wrong is we didn't have much of a compass over these 25, 30 years. We couldn't quite figure out our own definition of success. Began with 41, but I think it was also true of the Clinton foreign policy and subsequently. Then I think under 43, the Iraq War was a real case of overreach. And then I think Obama's foreign policy was more often than not a case of underreach. And he was a typical example where you overreact to your predecessor. And then Trump's qualitatively
It's
different.
sitting in people, there's always the shadow. That lurking right, it's Boo in To Kill a Mockingbird. He's right behind, Bush 43 is right behind the door.
Exactly, and it's on your mind, and in some ways you define yourself in opposition.
Right.
And again, what's so interesting about Trump is he defines himself in opposition to all of these people we've just talked about, from 41 through 44, because Trump is the first president in many ways who's out of the mainstream. You may see that as a good thing or a bad thing, depending on your politics.
I'll make that judgment now. Bad. Okay. U.S. history for 200. Bad. Okay.
Just entered the lightning round.
Yeah.
No, and or to put another way is every president, I would argue, is within the 40-yard lines.
Yeah.
The ones we've been talking about, and many others. Trump is the first president in many ways in an end zone. My enthusiasm for it, shall we say, is constrained, as is yours. But he is qualitatively different, even though in some ways there's probably a little bit more overlap between him and some of Obama's foreign policy than either would be comfortable with.
No, I can answer. I don't want to, as a chief of staff, speak for the president, but I'll speak for the former president. But let me ask you a question then on a lesson learned.
Yes, sir.
So China into the WTO, we thought it was going to moderate their behavior or modulate their behavior. And you go in as a developed country, it should have been a trigger that says once you become the second largest economy in the world, you're not developing anymore, you're developed. And there wasn't. Fast forward that to lessons learned, unlearned on the Iran agreement, which is there's assumption that if they get in the nuclear deal, they will modulate their behavior. The youth will come, the business class will speak up, and they will be more of a responsible world player than not. The other part of it, Trump answered, is the other side, is, we already know what we have to know about the Revolutionary Guard. We already know what they're doing in France or in Denmark and other things. They haven't modulated one iota, and this is a bad deal. What could China, and I'm not saying they're perfect analogies, but one had an assumption that didn't bear out. Should we have learned a lesson in the Iran deal, and should there be a trigger? Should have been something else, because in 10 years, the boundaries are off, or the bondage is off.
It's funny you bring that up, because I've been thinking about writing a piece about it. By and large,
Do you want to co-author it? I need something from my mother's refrigerator door.
looking for things to do?
Yeah. I got a lot of time on the bike, okay?
The idea that agreements tend to transform other societies tends to be exaggerated. We should probably just look at agreements more on their own terms. So bringing China into the WTO, if you get the bonus of transformation, great. But you've really got to go into it thinking, we're not going to get that. Do we simply get behavioral adjustments that we want to see? Well, going back to the Cold War, Kennan's idea that successful containment would also mellow the Soviet Union, that was the bonus. It still made sense on its merits just to stop Soviet expansion whenever he could. So with Iran, I would say too much to hope for transformation. To me, that was never realistic, particularly because it was really a nuclear-only agreement. It was enough that it constrained their nuclear ambitions. Where I think they got it wrong was not simply on hoping for transformation, but also the nuclear limits were not sufficiently severe. I would have basically argued the sunset provisions were way too short, and we ought to have demanded a much longer term agreement, and we could have lived without one at that point. I would have basically pushed harder.
That said, then, would you have gone forward with the agreement and supported it to be ratified? Or I know it was not ratified and had to be voted for, but do you support it as a treaty? Did you support what Trump did? Should there have been...
No, the answer was it wasn't the agreement I would have negotiated, but once it was in place, then I thought we were wrong to unilaterally get out of it. Indeed, it was one of probably the only area where Iran's behavior in the short run was okay. In the nuclear realm, they were complying with the treaty. The bigger problem with Iran
is what was left out of the treaty?
Yeah, which is not a criticism of the treaty, just to be clear. We had successful treaties with the Soviets during the Cold War that didn't solve everything, and I think that's an incorrect judgment or test of any agreement that it's got to solve everything. If a treaty solves something or constrains one problem, that's okay. Now, your response to it has to be commensurate both with what it does and what it doesn't do.
So your basic view is don't bet long. Does this agreement, when you look at WTO, you look at the Iran agreement, does it achieve what you want?
Right.
Don't bet on the bonus round.
Don't bet on the bonuses. And it's a degree of modesty. The idea that you can have one agreement and think it's going to overwhelm culture, history, politics, economics, that tends not to be the way history works.
Okay. When you look at foreign policy, and I know you worked in State Department, Defense Department, et cetera, we get a nominee. They want to bring a bipartisan group together. You got North Korea, you got Russia, you got China, you got the Mideast, you got the economy, and then you got all these other diseases and climate change, immigration, migration, et cetera. How do you tell, on the off chance that a Democrat would win, how do you prioritize? How do you get this, if you think what Trump has done to America is wrong, how do you get it back in some semblance where America is respected again and its voice is heard?
I think there's some things you could do.
With the assumption being that we've somehow, in the last 4 years, which I think, I don't want to put words in your mouth, have diminished America around the globe.
I believe we have. I think we've raised fundamental questions about our predictability, our reliability. The analogy I often use is to healthcare. We've disrupted and not replaced a lot when it comes to our foreign policy.
You had to do that to me, didn't you?
Sorry.
Okay, this is a short interview. No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Just became shorter.
Yeah.
So, look, there's some things like I would do quickly, like TPP. I would say Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Right.
Are there ways the United States could figure out a way to enter the agreement, which we originally one of the 12 architects? That would be something. Some things you don't even have to change substantively. It's just attitude, relations with allies, the consultations. You know this from your own experience. A lot of foreign policy is about relationships. It's about consulting. It's not about negotiating. It's about the give and take. Climate change, regulatory policy. There are things that we could do pretty quickly that would essentially send the message there's a new sheriff in town. A lot of the world would be pretty relieved, happy to hear that. Other things will take time. Even if you had a new approach to North Korea, you can't negotiate that overnight. Iran, we've been talking about. Iran's going to be just as difficult for the 46th president as it's been for the 45th. And in some areas, I actually would say you don't want to necessarily correct what this president has done. I think he's been right on China to call them out about some of their trade behaviors. And they're beginning to tackle some of the structural problems of China no longer being a developing country. On Venezuela, I think this administration's been right to call out Maduro, held off unilateral action. There are things now the next president may have to do, particularly if Maduro hangs on, looking at other ways to maybe get him out, or if and when he does leave, how do we make sure the day after in Venezuela we're prepared for it? How do we reestablish conditions of security? How do we establish economic and political conditions so the millions of refugees will be incentivized to return? I would probably argue for the next president to put together something like a 6-month package. What are the things that you can do fairly quickly, and what are the things...
Basically hit the reset on a couple things to send a singular message about America.
Exactly that. In some ways, a more traditional, familiar America is back. That there's two ways to look at the history. Let me take a step back. What Trump, I think, has basically sent a message is that the last 70 years are the aberration. And now there's a new America and a new American foreign policy. I think that's wrong, because I think the last 70 years, by and large, have been pretty good for us. The next president, I would say, what he or she needs to do is send the message that the Trump era has been something of an aberration. And now we're going to return to the larger elements of what has informed U.S. foreign policy, again, I would think successfully since World War II.
Well, do you think you can going back is right, or actually there's certain, I try to separate Every president's complained about NATO allies not ponying up. The problem is he's not wrong, but he goes about it all the wrong ways. China, I would argue, at least on NAFTA, having been there with President Clinton, going about those things all the wrong ways doesn't mean you can't have a and then for all the pain and disruption and everything else about NAFTA, and which was seen more as an immigration policy, which it never had accomplished, was one of the things I would say the elite got wrong. Is he goes about it so wrong, you can't separate the style and the approach because of the collateral damage.
Sure, and style is substance at one level. Relationships and alliances matter beyond some of the immediate things. So I take your point. And it's not enough just to go back. Some things you need to undo, some things you need to adjust, some things you have to go forward. I mean, NAFTA is a good example. There weren't provisions dealing with digital commerce. Right. Obviously, you have to go forward. Climate change, I would say you need to go forward because Paris is inadequate. Even on Iran, to simply go back to the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear, is inadequate now because the sunset provisions are too close. I would actually leverage our willingness to embrace the agreement with extension of some of the provisions, and I think the Europeans would buy into that. So
you think the Russian and Chinese will
be resistance, but then if we could get the Europeans on board, that might be enough to put pressure on the Iranians.
You wrote about, and this somewhat, again, this show's about me, not about you. You're just a stand-in here,
well,
so let's be clear about this.
I understand my role here.
Yeah, because at the end of 20, you'll see where the question's going.
Yes, sir.
For President Obama, a memo, he said, what do you think on the second term? I gave him two things, one of which I said, Bush said it was remembered for the wall coming down, the end of the Cold War. I think that would have happened on any president, but he's remembered for that. Same way the budget was going to be balanced, President Clinton made a decision, get in front of that parade. For President Obama, America's energy independence. I told him, you're going to get in the second term something that 7 presidents before have never gotten. And you wrote about reevaluating our relationship with Saudi Arabia. Could we do that without America's role today in energy production in the world? And what does that mean to foreign policy for the United States?
When I wrote, you mentioned before, one of my previous books, Foreign Policy Begins at Home, one of the things I was worried about was America's energy dependence. And it's been extraordinary what's happened.
Disruptor, unbelievable.
The last decade, what we have done is extraordinary. The shale revolution, fracking, the rest. And we turned a vulnerability and a liability into a strategic asset. It's really quite remarkable. And it's economically, but also strategically, which is what your question gets at. It's really liberated us. It's given us a position that really 40, 50 years we didn't have. One piece of good news, it does make us less dependent on the Saudis. The Saudi leadership that we're seeing out of the Crown Prince is often the diplomatic word would be injudicious. The other word would be reckless. So the idea that we're not as dependent or reliant on that, I think, is a healthy thing because it rebalances the leverage between us.
Let me go to Israel for a second.
Sure.
Is the Gulf here, not just the United States and Israel, but the Gulf really is between American Jews and Israelis?
I think there's a gulf between secular liberal American Jews, which is probably 75% of the American Jewish community, and a right-wing or conservative governments in Israel over some foreign policy, but also over the basic issues of who's a Jew, conversion issues, and so forth. So you've got that. The real supporters now of Israel, the unconditional supporters of Israel in this country, are Orthodox Jews and evangelicals. The majority of American Jews are no longer unconditional supporters of Israel.
Do you think that how will that impact Americans' foreign policy then? And how do you interpret the recent Israeli elections of a person with a lot of questions about his conduct in office at this point? I forgot where the Attorney General in Israel is at this point.
The way I look at Bibi Netanyahu's apparent victory is that there's no left to speak of in Israel. You've got the right and the far right, and what this seems to me is Israel's essentially on a course where it doesn't much care about diplomacy, much more interested in unilateralism. I think the two-state solution's on life support, and that's the direction Israel's going to go in. And to me, the tragedy of this is that someone who I've lived in Israel, care about it, is that I worry about what this means for the future of a Jewish democratic state. And drift is a policy. To me, it's not a wise one, but I think we've got drift. The demographic realities will kick in. And there's a tension between Israel's Jewishness and Israel's democratic essence. And I never wanted to choose. And what I fear about Netanyahu is he's putting Israel on a course where it's increasingly going to have to choose, and that will have implications, not just for its society, but for its relationship with the rest of the world, its relationship with the United States, its relationship with American Jewry.
Yeah, I mean, as Yogi Berra said, when you get to a fork in the road, take it. And they've postponed that decision.
But postponing has real consequences.
Yeah.
Like you've been around the Situation Room more than most. And one of my experiences is that people look at every option that comes up for a policy and say, oh, we don't want to do that. That's costly. Oh, we don't want to do that. That's expensive. So more often than not, you fall back on the status quo. But people rarely look at the status quo, at drift or continuity, with the same degree of rigor. So often you end up.
No, I mean, I always say that if you go past a lot of the exit ramps and then the choices get so much more expensive, which if you taken them up 2 miles back, they'd have been a cheaper price.
There's very little in government about that's like red wine. The choices don't get better with time and age. And the Middle East, every time we miss an exit, to use your analogy, a couple of years later we go, gee, things looked a little bit better, back when on the highway. And that invariably, that's what it looks like on this.
Do you think the strongman personality, Trump, the president of Brazil, Netanyahu, the president of Hungary, etc. Is this a moment in time, or is this the new norm?
Well, the answer is it's both. It's a new norm. It's just not permanent.
You don't think so?
Well, these things are cyclical. Look at Latin America. You've had pendulum swings between more democratic.
You wouldn't describe the
more
United States as Latin America in the sense of its politics, would you?
No, but we're less immune to swings of the pendulum than I would have thought. I mean, I don't know where you come out on this, but one of the things I've learned in the last couple of years is to assume less. And the fabric of American society is a little bit less resilient or more brittle than I would have thought. The nature of our role in the world is a little bit less predictable than I would have thought. The degree of variability is actually much greater. One of the areas I just underestimated, and I was a little bit too complacent when I looked at the country or but this degree of populism we're seeing around the world for lots of reasons. You see it for cultural reasons, immigration. You see it for economic reasons,
Yes.
inequality, a lack of opportunity. I take that seriously. Now, it could get worse. We haven't talked about it here today, but imagine you have, because of robotics and AI and all that, large-scale disappearance of work. That would mean that the kind of populism we're seeing in this country, not only does it not fade, it gets worse. So, I mean, I take it seriously. But on the other hand, there are policy responses out there.
I mean, I take our moment, and this gets back to the first question. I mean, not the Brooklyn question, but about what the elite got wrong. I still think American politics right now, from the Iraq War to the financial meltdown, is that you can argue those policies sold by the elite on behalf of America came home to roost domestically in our politics because we were fundamentally wrong. And I think you don't have a poor person's revolt, you have a middle class revolt.
Fair enough.
Very different than a kind of poverty driven revolt. And they basically said, we're writing $1.5 trillion over here to Iraq. We wrote $800 billion to the bankers who never said they were sorry or wrong. Nobody's ever admitted they're wrong. And our kids can't when they get to college, they can't get a job afterward. They're still in the basement. You know what? Go to hell. And that's what happened.
A lot of people are saying this is not what I signed up for, and I agree. I mean, the wars, there is an intervention fatigue because of these wars that proved to be expensive. And what made it worse is they were largely discretionary wars, what I call wars of choice. You mentioned the financial crisis. People missed it coming. That was an elite failure. I mean, as good as elements of the response were.
No, the policy was great. The politics stunk.
Even the policy wasn't great in preventing it. Policy was good in response to it. No,
True.
so people look, we have a government where you entrust people, such as yourself at times, me at various times, with incredible responsibilities. And I think there's been a sense that people have made too many mistakes. And this, how would I put it, there's been a disconnect between who's made the mistakes and who's paid the price for it.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you went to the Iraq War, you got a bunch of people advocating something, and a lot of people felt like themselves or their children weren't part of this choice or the price. And the same thing, I argued in the White House for financial reform immediately after the stimulus because I thought we needed, as I said then publicly, Old Testament justice. somebody had to be held accountable. And I think a lot of people feel nobody in the elite is ever held accountable for any of their
And I
actions.
think that's part of the appeal of Trump is there is a sense of resentment.
Mm-hmm.
He is, whatever else you think about him, he is good, I think, at reading this sense of what you're getting at, that whether it's middle class anger or frustration, people who feel that things are going on in this country and that it's not working for them anymore. There's a sense of resentment out there. Some of it misplaced, but he taps into it.
Okay, we just described America, but can you then just tell me why Hungary, Italy, Brazil? This is not just, I mean, I know what drove it in America, or at least I feel like I know it.
Harder in places like Hungary and Poland, because one would have thought coming out of the Cold War,
given the growth,
this ought to have been their golden moment.
Right.
Political freedom and economic success. So there you end up saying, is there something culturally there? The institutions hadn't developed,
Right.
that they hadn't really become more civil society hadn't developed in certain ways, that they were still more top-heavy societies than we would have thought. Parts of Europe, I think there's right-wing explanations. The cultural impact of the massive waves of immigration, particularly in Germany and how others saw it. Then I think you've got just frustration, low economic growth for years, inequality. Society is not really delivering things. The gap between what's going on in nation states, what's going on in Brussels. It's harder to generalize.
So let me, another part, Africa.
Yes, sir.
You have a public revolt in both Algeria and in Sudan.
Yeah.
You have a civil war in Libya. That's happening there. And then a crackdown obviously in Egypt, still going.
Right.
Okay. I'm impressed with what's happened in both Algeria and Sudan.
Right.
I would never have predicted in Sudan you would have what I would call peaceful demonstration and protest that would change a government.
Right.
Somewhat similar to Algeria without real violence. That's, I think, a healthy phenomena.
Absolutely.
And then, but how do you describe what's happening in the north, at least the northern part of Africa right now, versus other parts of Africa?
Well, Africa is always hard to generalize about. And
Okay.
I'm not the world's living expert either, but you've got 50-odd countries.
Yeah, but you're the only one on the show, so you better play the expert. Otherwise, it's up to me, man. Okay? Okay.
Came all this way to New York.
I know. I'm interrupting the Masters game. Let's hurry up. Okay.
It's not a game.
Yeah. Well, that's how much I know about golf. Okay.
Hard to generalize. It's interesting what's happened in Sudan and Algeria. We'll see if it lasts.
Right.
Not the first time you've had these kinds of things in.
But this is peaceful.
It's peaceful and it's exciting and
Right.
it's positive. But we'll see if it stays peaceful. We'll see what it transitions to. Long way to go before. But still, I take your point. Positive signs. We're seeing no political change though in places like Egypt, which is still, by the way, a third or a quarter of the Arab world. Libya is a colossal mistake, which I think the previous administration deserves a lot of responsibility for. First for going in, and then not for following it.
Bad precedent that reverberates beyond the boundaries of Libya.
Oh yeah,
Goes into Syria.
And exactly, it helped discredit the whole idea of R2P, of responsibility to protect. It really soured the Chinese and Russians on anything like this because they saw it as a bait and switch, that we're really after regime change. Other parts of Africa are disappointing still in many ways. You look at South Africa and Nigeria, the two, what ought to be the two anchors of Africa, and both are having trouble. The politics of both are really disappointing. There's lots of violence still in Nigeria, South Africa, lots of corruption. Can't quite get on track.
I'll give you a success there. Ghana.
Ghana as well. Look, there's probably 10 or 12 successes.
Right.
The worrisome thing to me about Africa is it's going to be one of the two parts of the world over the next 20, 30 years where you're going to have an enormous demographic bulge. You're seeing it coming in South Asia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and you're seeing it coming in Africa. So even if there are real gains in economic growth, I'm worried that the denominator is going to get so much bigger that it's going to absorb. So growth per capita won't really go
It
up
won't
that much.
feed the politics that you need. The
That's
stability.
That's my concern.
I want to slightly end because it's not a game, Richard. The Masters is a golf tournament. Okay,
It's serious stuff.
Okay,
It's not a game.
Well, I'll take you to a Final Four with me, and then we'll see a real game. Okay. I want to. Your foreign policy. I was steeped in foreign policy. 16 years here at the council. You're sitting in the domestic council with the president, and you were right that this barriers between foreign policy and domestic policy have basically that line, the sand dune has blown away. It's just okay. 5 things you got to get right domestically.
5 things
And because I got my foreign policy list, and I shouldn't be in that room either. So,
One is immigration reform across the board, dealing with all acts, not just the illegal, but legal, and the 12 million people who are here. Without documentation. I would think about, healthcare, and we can argue about how to do it, but I would not do something that got rid of all private insurance. I would do something that's supplementary. I would deal with student loans. I'm interested in the idea that students, rather than taking on debt, start looking at how they would maybe through equity pay it back as a percentage of earnings I'm intrigued by that. A real effort to prepare for the new technologies, major programs to deal with helping workers retrain, re-educate, get financial assistance so they're more mobile and they can deal with that. I'd like to do something more with K through 12 education, which seems to me critical, but I can't figure out how to.
I'll bring you to Chicago. We'll show you what we've done.
But you've actually done some interesting things there, also with teacher training and how to figure out
free community college
things. But education, infrastructure, both for jobs, for competitiveness. It's an enormous agenda, and we should tackle it both for its own sake. But again, I don't think we're going to have the resources, but even the bandwidth. To play the kind of role we need to in the world, unless we get a lot of this sorted out here.
I've always thought we got nothing to fear from China. We have to fear ourselves first.
It's the pogo argument. Yeah. If we get ourselves straightened out, then it actually will allow us to do a lot of what we need to do. Plus, it's an important part of foreign policy. It's the competition of examples. If we show that our politics, our economics, our society are admirable and successful, hey, guess what? No one's going to be talking about the Chinese model. They're going to want to emulate the American model. So if we get it right, it's good for us. But it's more important than what people in the State Department do if we can show that.
Well, that I'll agree with.
Well, then you should be happy. There's very few people left there.
As we used to say, keep that memo away from the president. It will filter bad ideas. So let me then close on a couple things. One is there's a lightning round on Chicago. So here's your test, okay? No. Yeah. You'll be okay. Cubs or Sox?
Cubs.
Thick or thin pizza?
Thin.
Sears or Hancock Building?
Oh, tough. Sears.
Okay. The river or the lake?
Love the river.
Okay. You get 12-inch or 16-inch softball?
No opinion.
Yeah. We'll have you back on the show. You passed. 4 out of 5 is not bad. So we're here with Richard Haass, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations here in the city in New York. Sorry on that.
The greatest city in the world. You were about to say?
Not New York, Chicago. Yeah, it's the most American of American cities. So I do think that if we got things right at home, you'd be amazed. Are you worried about democracy?
At the risk of ending on a down note.
Yeah.
For the first time in my life, I am.
We can edit it out if you want.
Okay.
Yeah.
I am a little bit worried about this. There's a kind of glibness, and you hear people all the time saying, we've been through tough times before, we'll be fine. The Churchill line, Americans can be counted on to do the right thing, but only after they do everything else. I worry a little bit about the glibness there. And I think one of the warnings of the last couple of years is don't assume, whether it's in the world or at home, things just work out. There's got to be a sense of urgency. There's got to be a sense of taking responsibility. They're more likely to work out if good people get involved and work hard so they do work out. Just to assume it's going to work out, therefore we don't have to vote or we don't have to get involved. No, I don't believe that.
You can't parallel park into success. You can't. I do think one thing I just recently wrote about is I am a firm believer in national service. I think we have to have a rite of passage for citizenship again, and I think that's what's...
It'd be great, and it should be it would help, one, it gives a sense of people from different walks of American life to meet one another. It's a great experience. It could be a way also to deal with loan forgiveness for students or of loan avoidance.
Your children, my children, should serve along kids from different backgrounds and walks of life in different parts of the country. And it's not an accident. Well, successful in the war, the greatest generation, the kids with vowels at the end of the name with other kids with different accents. I think
it's not an accident. It's not a coincidence. You're right.
Richard, thanks for being here. I'll let you back to the TV. I know you had to come to the office to watch the golf game. It may say something about the Haass home. That's all we'll say. We'll leave it there for domestic bliss, and I mean domestic. Thanks.
Thank you, Ron.
You've been listening to Chicago Stories with Mayor Emanuel. You can subscribe and leave a review on Apple Podcasts. And tweet your guest ideas using #ShyStories. Thanks for listening.